A Gruesome Difference. 2 films for tomorrow night on One.
In a very large house in a place called Jorashako in North Calcutta, there once lived a boy. There were not many boys quite like him. Indeed, there were not many families quite like this boy's. For instance, his grandfather, who was called Dwarkanath, gave in charities almost as fabulously as he earned in business. His son Debendranath, the boy's father, was quite exceptional too. A rich man's son brought up in luxury, he yet lost faith in worldly possessions and found solace in a monotheistic religion that was based on the Upanishads. He called it Brahmaism and sought to spread it. He found many followers, and they gave him the name of Maharshi, the great sage. As for brothers and sisters, the boy had 13, all older than he. There was Dejendranath, the first brother, a philosopher who wrote poetry and loved mathematics. Second brother Satyendranath, a Sanskrit scholar who became the first Indian member of the Indian Civil Service. Fifth brother Jyotirindranath, a born musician who translated Molière and Sanskrit dramas into Bengali verse. And sister Sharna Kumari, the first woman novelist of India. In time, the boy was sent to school.
Yes.
He went to 4 schools, hated them all. Luckily, there was brother Hemendranath to look after his studies at home. When the boy was 12, he was taken on a trip by his father. The last stop on a long tour was the hill station of Dalhousie in the Punjab. It was the boy's first taste of free communion with nature, and the first opportunity to know his great father, who was now his only parent. He learned to rise before the sun and to say his prayers. To handle money and keep accounts. The boy was only 13 when his first book of verse came out. When he was 16, he was already writing stories, essays, and poems in a literary magazine called Bharati, brought out by his brother Dejendranath. When he was 18, he was sent to England. If the idea was to give the boy a regular education, it came to naught, for he returned a year later without completing his course of studies at the London University. But his visit was not in vain, for he learned something of Western music. An Irish ballad he loved provided the source for a tune in his enchanting opera, Valmiki Pratibha. When Valmiki Pratibha was performed in the Jorashako residence, he himself played the role of the bandit-turned-poet. One man was particularly impressed by the play and the performance, and said the boy would go far. This was the greatest literary figure of the time, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Rabindranath Tagore not only became the great literary figure that Bankim prophesied, his genius flowered in ways as diverse as is conceivable in one single individual. One of the strongest influences that molded Rabindranath as man and artist was nature, and he first came into contact with it upon assuming responsibilities in his zamindari estates in East Bengal. He lived mostly in his houseboat and watched life as it passed by. It was the very heart of rural Bengal. It was a world in which the moods of people and the moods of nature were inextricably interwoven. The people found room in a succession of great short stories, and nature in an outpouring of exquisite songs and poems. Dominant was the mood of the rains, exultant and terrible. Rabindranath's second great involvement was in the political sphere. In 1905, India's Governor-General Lord Curzon proposed that Bengal be divided into two provinces. What this amounted to, in fact, was an artificial rift between the two main religious groups, the Hindus and the Muslims. The scheme merely fanned the flame of patriotism that had been smoldering in the minds of certain visionaries all through the period of the Renaissance in Bengal. The series of stirring patriotic songs that Rabindranath composed for the occasion sang of the brotherhood of Bengalis regardless of caste or creed. Meanwhile, Rabindranath had undertaken a task of major importance. In 1862, Rabindranath had acquired a property in Bolpur in the district of Birbhum in West Bengal. According to his wishes, a seat of prayer and a temple of worship had been built, and close to the temple, a residential house which was called Shantiniketan, the abode of peace. Rabindranath started an educational experiment here in 1901. It was a school, but not like the schools of his own childhood.
Yes, I can see a box.
It was like the forest hermitages of ancient India. The hardships that Rabindranath had to face in order to bring the school into being would surely have daunted a lesser man. And to add to it, within 4 years of its opening, he lost his wife and 2 children. was to acquaint the West with his work at Shantiniketan, as well as to study the educational methods of the West, that Rabindranath went to Europe in 1912. With him, he had a notebook containing his own English translations of some of his poems. In introducing these poems to a gathering of English writers and intellectuals, the poet Yeats said, "I know of no man in my time who has done anything in the English language to equal these lyrics. Even as I read them in these literal English translations, they're exquisite in style and thought." Gitanjali was published in England in the same year. There has rarely been another instance of a poet gaining world fame in like manner. The Nobel Prize came in 1913. In 1915, Rabindranath was given a knighthood. 4 years later, he renounced it as a result of a political involvement nearly as great as that of the first. The Rowlatt Bill dashed India's hopes of gaining the self-government that the British rulers had kept promising through the years of the First World War. Dominating the Indian political scene at this time was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. As a protest against the Rowlatt Act, Gandhi launched a movement of passive resistance. The masses misinterpreted the movement, and as a result, violence broke out in many parts of the country. The government started taking repressive measures out of all proportion to the magnitude of the violence, culminating in a brutal killing of an unarmed crowd at Amritsar. The news trickled through a gagged press and reached Rabindranath. But the Defense of India Act was still in force, and no leaders would support him in a plea for a meeting of protest. On the morning of May the 30th, Rabindranath finished writing a letter. It was addressed to the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford. Rabindranath concluded by saying, "I, for my part, wish to stand shorn of all special distinctions by the side of my countrymen who, for their so-called insignificance, are liable to suffer degradation not fit for human beings. And these are the reasons which have painfully compelled me to ask Your Excellency to relieve me of my title of knighthood." At an age when most men retire from activity, Rabindranath had his most restless and active period. The urge to travel and the necessity to collect funds for his school, which had now grown into a university, took him to all parts of the world. He was greeted with open arms, and this was as much due to the force of his physical presence as to the philosophy that he stood for. Wherever he went, he spread the message of peace and stressed the importance of intellectual cooperation between nations. He said, "The time has come to prepare oneself for the dawn of a new era, when man must rediscover his soul in the spiritual unity of all human beings." He also said, "I do not put my faith in any new institutions, but in the individuals all over the world who think clearly, feel nobly, and act rightly, for they are the channels of moral truth." His great humanist ideas found an echo in the best minds of Europe, some of whom were to become his close friends. In the meantime, the institution at Shantiniketan had grown from its modest beginnings. It was now the Vishwa Bharati, where the arts were taught under great masters like Nandalal Bose and Dinendranath Tagore, and provisions had been made for conducting Oriental studies by scholars who came from all parts of the world. Such men were Levy, Lesnie, Winternitz, and Stenkonov. But there were some Europeans who did even more than that. Charles Freer Andrews, who had been present at Yeats' reading of Gitanjali, and William Winstanley Pearson, who had also met the poet in England, came to Shantiniketan in the early days and stayed on until their death, working with a selfless devotion to the poet and his cause that few Indians could equal. In 1930, Rabindranath visited Oxford, where he delivered the series of Hibbert lectures, which were later published as The Religion of Man. It was also on this tour the Rabindranath visited Soviet Russia for the first time. On the eve of his departure from Moscow, Rabindranath told his hosts, "You have discovered the truth that in extirpating all social evils, one has to go to the root, and the only way to it is through education." In Russia, as well as in other countries that he visited on this tour, Rabindranath held exhibitions of his paintings. At the age of 70, Rabindranath had found a new outlet for his creative urge. It was astonishing the way it began. The Golden Book of Tagore, brought out on the occasion of his 70th birthday, was a testimony to the love and reverence that the intellectuals of the world bore for Rabindranath. One of its 5 sponsors was Mahatma Gandhi. In physical appearance, in personal habits, and in general outlook, the two differed considerably. At several moments of crisis in India's political history, the two had disagreed over the course of action. But these were on the surface. Their deeper affinity transcended all occasional barriers. The last years of the poet's life were spent largely in his beloved Shantiniketan. A lesser man might well have been content to spend the declining years in restful contemplation. But never for a day was Rabindranath content to rest on his laurels. Indeed, the last years of his life produced some of his most striking, original, and mature works. His health was failing now, but calls of duty, which he was ever ready to answer, gave him little rest.
নামটুকু ডাকা অকারণে কাছে এসে হাতে হাত রাখা দূরে গেলে একা বসে মনে মনে ভাবা কাছে এলে দুই চোখে কথা ভরা আভা কাহারে জড়ায়ে ঘিরে ভরিয়া তুলিব ধীরে জীবনের কদিনের কাঁদা আর হাসা ধন নয় মান নয় কিছু ভালোবাসা করেছেন আশা।
Rabindranath's 80th birthday fell on the 8th of May, 1941. 3 months later, he was to leave Shantiniketan, never to return. Tonight, for the occasion, he had composed a message, his last message to the world. It was called Crisis in Civilization. It concerned itself with the state of the so-called modern civilization, a civilization that was being shaken to its very roots by barbaric wars of aggression. In the course of the message, Rabindranath said, "I had at one time believed that the springs of civilization would issue out of the heart of Europe. But today, when I'm about to leave the world, that faith has deserted me. I look around and see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility. And yet, I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in man. I shall look forward to a new dawn, to a new chapter in history, when the Holocaust will end and the air will be rendered clean with the spirit of service and sacrifice. Perhaps the dawn will come from this horizon, from the east where the sun rises. On that day will unvanquished man retrace his path of conquest, surmounting all barriers to win back his lost human heritage.